On Monday, February 14th, 1955, Detroit woke to a cold that seemed to trap your breath inside your chest. The kind when the thermometer drops well below zero and the air cuts your skin within the first block. At that same start of the shift, a notice pinned to a corkboard in Dearborn would decide, without fanfare, whether an assembler would continue to be needed or would become just another easy-to-replace name. In a time when factories still ran 3 shifts and time clock and production discipline were as solid as steel. For anyone with rent coming due, children growing, and a badge that separated warmth from ice inside the house, change did not arrive as a headline or a speech. It arrived as a requirement. Read diagrams, mark numbers, sign statistical control forms, with carbon paper, standardized fields, and the obligation to leave a written trail for internal audit. And it arrived together with a silent question, repeated with every machine stroke. How long could a man hold out without learning a new language? Ice had gathered in crusts at the corners of the sidewalks along Michigan Avenue, hardened by days of thaw and refreeze, and the river wind carried a metallic taste that slipped through the gaps in wool coats and upturned collars. At 5:40 a.m., still dark, Antonio Tony Ferreira crossed the street in front of the streetcar stop, stepping around a frozen puddle that shone like glass under the yellow light of the lampposts. His factory badge tapped against the pocket of his coveralls with every step, and that sound was not just plastic. It was the sound of what kept the house warm, milk on the table, rent paid on time in the row of duplexes near Verner Highway, on the city's southwest side, where gas heat and winter bills arrived with dates and stamps that did not wait. Before the shift whistle, the supervisor pinned a new notice to the board beside the production numbers, where daily targets and station totals lined up. The typed letters, perfectly straight, carried the weight of a sentence, with a date and departmental language. It said that starting March 1st, internal transfers to certain skilled posts would require reading diagrams, interpreting drawings, and filling out statistical process control forms with measurement records and charts that had to be signed. The word statistical sounded foreign, as if it had been brought in by someone who had never put his hands on a block of cold metal. Tony was not old, but he was not new either. He was 38, with broad hands and old calluses, and a way of conserving motion to make it through the whole day, like someone who learns to spare shoulder and wrist so as not to lose the rhythm. He had come to Detroit after the war, in 1948, from Fall River, Massachusetts, with an accent already worn down by the noise of presses and by living alongside men from the South and the West. He had worked at 2 plants before landing a spot on an automotive components assembly line in the Dearborn area, near Rotunda Drive, where routine was marked by sirens, time clocks, and quality inspections that, until then, had seemed like something for another department. The work was repetitive, but predictable, and predictable was the word that held up a family. On the morning of February 14th, the pace of the shop floor felt slightly faster, as if the news had put an invisible pressure into the air, along with the demand not to stop the line. The smell of oil, rubber, and sweat mixed with machine steam and the heated air circulating through ducts, always with an undertone of hot metal and grease. Tony fitted parts, tightened bolts, checked alignment with the same quiet attention as always, following jigs and reference marks. Only now his mind kept returning to the notice, as if the paper were an open wound that would not close. At the coffee break, near the fogged windows, a younger co-worker, Eddie Kowalski, jerked his chin toward the board. "Now at school," he said, blowing on thin coffee served in a plain cup, hot more from steam than from taste. Near him, Mr. Jenkins, thinning hair and a wedding band polished from rubbing against his pants, answered without looking at anyone, "It's paper. Paper cuts more than steel." Tony stayed quiet. His tongue felt heavy, as if speaking would confirm a fear. He had already heard stories from other plants, of new machines arriving with instructions and demanding people who could read a table, fill out an inspection card, and understand tolerance without asking for help. There were rumors about operations being reorganized, about methods and efficiency coming in the door with clipboard engineers and stopwatches, and about the line being redesigned to reduce dead time. The word that circulated in the corridors was replaceable. It was not an announced layoff, not a direct threat. It was worse, the feeling that the line could keep going without one body, as long as another body knew how to fill out a sheet. When the shift ended at 3:30 p.m., the sun appeared for a few minutes, pale, and then hid again behind low clouds. Tony walked to the parking lot where his used Ford, a 1949 he maintained carefully, waited with its stubborn engine, demanding choke and patience in the cold. When it started, the radio crackled and let out a piece of news about the economy, about cars coming off the lines like never before, about sales and production up. The words prosperity and modernization came through with the static. Tony turned it off. Prosperity was good, but modernization tasted like a notice pinned to a board. At home, in southwest Detroit, the kitchen was small and warm, heat concentrated where the stove and oven worked. Steam from the stew rose from the pot. His wife, Lucia, folded clothes on the table with a method that also seemed like a way of praying, aligning seams and separating pieces by size. Their oldest son, Paul, was 11 and did homework with a furrowed brow. Their daughter, Maria, 7, drew a crooked car with crayons. Lucia looked at Tony's face and understood before she heard. "Something at the factory," she said, not turning it into a question. Tony took off his coat and hung it carefully, as if the fabric could break, and as if the gesture were part of keeping order. He told her about the notice, the new requirements, the way the word competence appeared on the paper, as if it were simple, office terms applied to line hands. Paul lifted his head, curious but not understanding. Lucia kept folding, but her fingers slowed. The idea came without decoration, like a grocery list, night school, library course. The push that moved Tony did not come from pride or a speech. It came from a gas bill stamped in February, from Paul's shoes getting tight, from Maria's cough worsening in the cold, from Lucia's look when she counted bills at the end of the month and separated what was rent, what was food, what was medicine. It also came from an old memory of Fall River, of seeing an uncle lose his job at the textile mill when the machines changed and no one explained anything, when change arrived as a rule and not as a conversation. The uncle had sat on the porch, staring at the street, as if the street suddenly had no place for him. Tony did not want to be that man, standing with empty hands and a head without tools. On the night of February 16th, 1955, a Wednesday, Tony walked into the neighborhood public library, a small branch near West Verner. The heaters clicked, and the air smelled of old paper and floor wax, with the typical silence of a reading room and the discreet creak of the floorboards. The librarian, in light-framed glasses, raised her eyes when he approached the desk. Tony removed his cap out of habit and asked for books on mechanical drawing, blueprint reading, quality control, things that came in hardbound manuals with technical language. The word statistics came out low, as if it might draw unwanted attention. She did not laugh. She only made a gesture as if she understood the weight hidden in certain words and set aside 2 hardbound manuals, the kind used in industrial courses and factory training. She wrote his name on a card in careful handwriting, and Tony felt that this, his name written down, was the beginning of a parallel life, with due dates and formal responsibility. He left with the books pressed to his chest, feeling the hard covers like new tools. Outside, the wind cut and the streetlights drew yellow circles on the ice. The following weeks became a 2-shift routine, the official one in the noise of the line and the secret one in the silence of the kitchen table after the children slept. The bulb above the sink made a circle of yellow light, and the rest of the house stayed in shadow, with the heater cycling on and off. Tony opened the manual and saw lines, arrows, symbols. Something seemed simple, like measuring a part and writing down a number. Others demanded a kind of attention he had not trained on the factory floor. Small letters, abbreviations, tables, tolerances, diameter and finish symbols, and a logic of recording variation as part of the job. The world of the drafting table had its own language, and he stumbled through it like someone learning to walk on a new surface. On Saturday, February 26th, Tony went to Southwestern High School on West 4th Street to ask about night classes. The hallway smelled of chalk and varnished wood, with rows of lockers and the echo of footsteps. Men of different ages sat in chairs waiting, some with hands stained with grease, others in work jackets still smelling of the plant. A poster announced basic mathematics for industry and drawing reading. Tony signed a paper and received a slip with time and room. The instructor, a thin man with a loosened tie, looked at the group of tired faces and spoke calmly. No shame in asking. Shame is signing without understanding. Tony kept the sentence as if it were a safety rule. At home, he began washing his hands more carefully before opening the notebook, as if cleanliness were respect for the effort, so as not to stain the pages with oil and to separate work from study. Lucia did not turn it into drama. She simply adjusted schedules, held things together, turned off lights early, left coffee ready. Her support was made of silence and well-done tasks. At the factory, March 1st arrived like a gate closing. On the board, besides the notice, a list appeared of internal openings for inspection and adjustment. They were less punishing on the body and paid a little more, but they required what the paper called competence, with a test and a record. Men looked at the list with a mix of desire and resentment. Some said it was a fad and would pass. Others had already given up and laughed too loudly, the laugh of someone trying to drive off fear. On Tuesday, March 8th, Tony approached the internal personnel office, a glass-fronted space where a secretary typed without lifting her head, with stacks of forms and staplers on the desk. He held the transfer form with hands that normally held metal. The paper had little boxes, lines, a place for reason, and another for relevant skills, fields that demanded legible handwriting. He had written slowly, firm letters, copying terms from the manual, blueprint reading, caliper measurement, understanding tolerances. It was half truth and half hope. The secretary looked over her glasses and said without inflection, "Test on Friday. Room 3B. Be there 10 minutes early." Tony nodded and left with the feeling he had crossed an invisible border. On Thursday, March 10th, he tried to study, but fatigue had physical weight, accumulated from shift, commute, and short nights. He fell asleep with his head near the book and woke with a stiff neck and a coffee stain marking the page. Lucia covered his shoulders with a blanket without saying anything. The next morning, she put a sandwich wrapped in wax paper into his lunch pail and indicated, with that simple gesture, that hunger got in the way as much as fear. On Friday, March 11th, 1955, Room 3B was on the second floor of an administrative building that smelled of paint and carbon paper, with aligned desks and hard chairs. 5 men sat down, each with a pencil and eraser. A young engineer, hair combed back, handed out sheets with diagrams. The figures looked simple until the moment they demanded interpretation. Which measurement was out of tolerance, which part needed adjustment, what value to enter on the control chart, with marked limits and space for observation. Tony felt sweat form on his back despite the cold air. The silence was heavy, and no one asked for clarification. His pencil hesitated at a diameter symbol. For a second, He confused it with another mark. Time seemed to leak away. In the chart section, the lines rose and fell like an electrocardiogram. The manual spoke of upper and lower limits, but the sheet asked for trend interpretation and corrective action. Tony wrote words that seemed appropriate and handed it in without knowing whether he had gotten it right. His fingers were cold when he returned the pencil. On Monday, March 14th, the result came out on a list taped beside the time clock, where everyone passed and no one could pretend not to see. 3 names were approved. Tony's was not there. He stared too long, as if the absence could take shape. The machine noise continued, indifferent, and that was what hurt. One man's defeat did not change the cadence of a line. Eddie appeared beside him, read the list, and did not joke. Maybe next time, he said softly, as if the phrase could protect. That night, Tony did not open the book. He sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the heater work and the pipes tick. Lucia sat nearby without touching him, as if touch might break something. The fear was concrete. It was not only losing the job. It was being stuck in a post that could disappear, becoming the man who watches and does not understand. It carried a silent shame that was not only his, it belonged to the era. The country spoke of the future, and the future arrived with paper and numbers. The following week, on March 21st, the supervisor announced changes on the line. 1 station would be automated, and 2 men would be reassigned, justified as reorganization and cycle time reduction. One of them was Mr. Jenkins. The other was a newly arrived kid. Jenkins, hearing it, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Paper cuts more than steel," he repeated, but the phrase now sounded tired. Jenkins was sent to industrial cleaning, with fewer overtime hours, the kind of change that showed up on the paycheck without needing explanation. He passed Tony at shift change, carrying a cardboard box of personal things, and said without looking, "There's no place for a slow hand." Tony saw on the box a possible preview, a portrait of what happened when the body could not keep up with change. That night he returned to the manual not with hope, but with an urgency that tasted like rust. He could not control the factory's decisions, but he could control what went into his head page by page. By the end of March, the night classes moved on to concepts of variation and average. The instructor drew on the board and spoke of a sample as if it were a handful of nuts in the palm, bringing the idea down to the shop floor. Tony began to understand that the chart was not just a drawing. It was a way of seeing the process. He learned to recognize when a line suggested something was drifting out of normal before it became a defect. It was not magic. It was organized attention. On April 5th, a Tuesday, Tony asked the instructor for extra exercises. The man looked at the grease-stained coveralls, the fatigue on Tony's face, and handed him a packet of problem sheets printed on plain paper. "Practice at home. It can be done," he said, as if asserting that effort still meant something. Tony carried the sheets as if they were spare parts. At home, Paul watched his father with quiet curiosity. One night, the boy pointed at a chart and said it looked like a mountain. Tony corrected him carefully and in a low voice, and the boy repeated the right word, as if he were training too. It was a word both of them knew, each in his own sense, and it brought the generations closer without needing a big conversation. On April 18th, the factory announced a new round of transfer tests, this time for quality inspector on the afternoon shift. Tony signed up again. Eddie did too. In the locker room, while they changed clothes, Eddie tried to sound light. "This time, it'll happen." Tony answered only, "Studying's done." The phrase sounded strange, like a label, but it was true. He had studied night after night, radio low, pencil worn down, his mind fighting sleep. The test would be on April 22nd. On the Thursday before, April 21st, 1955, Detroit had a day of cold, fine rain that turned the street into a dirty mirror, with dark mud at the edges where old snow gave way. Tony left his shift and drove home with steady hands on the wheel. The windshield wiper squeaked. A slow song came on the radio, and he turned it off, preferring the sound of rain and engine. When he arrived, he found Lucia with an opened envelope on the table. It was a letter from the landlord announcing a rent increase starting in June. The paper had the chill of a decree, with date and amount. No room for negotiation. Lucia spoke without raising her voice. "It's going to tighten." Tony looked at the envelope, the pot on the stove, the children on the floor. The future became more concrete. He sat down with the manual and the packet of exercises. There was no beautiful choice. There was only choice. On Friday, April 22nd, Tony took the test with a strange calm, as if his brain had accepted that fear did not help. He read the diagram, marked tolerances, identified an out-of-control point on the chart, and wrote a simple corrective action. Stop and check the cutting tool. He handed it in feeling something close to relief, but not confidence. Confidence was a luxury. The irreversible event, however, did not come from paper. It came from the factory floor. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1955, on Monday, the department was in a hurry. A large order had to go out, and the supervisor walked fast checking numbers, with the typical urgency of end-of-lot and deadline pressure. Tony was at his usual station, repeating motions, when he heard a different snap, a dry sound followed by a short shout. One of the new guys, Raymond, had his hand caught for an instant in a moving part whose guard should have been down. It happened too fast to become an act of courage, too fast to become a neat story. Blood appeared before anyone understood the exact shape of the accident. The line noise dropped and then stopped, as when power is cut or an emergency stop is hit. The air filled with voices and footsteps. Tony saw Raymond pale, eyes wide, his hand wrapped in improvised cloth. Someone called the infirmary. The supervisor, face tight, kept telling the men to step back. Raymond babbled, and Tony caught the broken phrase, "Guard didn't lock." He did not get too close. He stayed a few steps away, seeing the scene as a physical warning of what it meant not to see the whole process. Later, the rumor crossed the locker room. 2 fingers were lost. There was no way to give them back. The factory would log it, fill out reports, discuss procedures. For Raymond, the hand would never be the same. For the others, the work would never again seem entirely mechanical. The line, already dangerous, now had a face. That night, Tony opened the manual not out of obligation, but out of contained anger and a kind of respect for what the factory called control. He thought of charts as a way to notice earlier, even if charts did not control everything. He thought that if the guard did not lock, someone should have noticed a trend, looseness, wherein written something down. And if no one wrote it down, it was because there was no time or because no one knew how. On May 4th, there was a quick meeting at the start of the shift. A man from safety talked about procedures, locks, a culture of attention, with a vocabulary of standards and responsibility. The words sounded too clean beside the blood still in memory. When he finished, the supervisor summed up, "No shortcuts." A reply came almost whispered from the back, ownerless. "Shortcuts are what's left." Tony stayed quiet. The sentence was true, and that was why it hurt. On May 9th, 1955, the results of the April 22nd test were posted on the board. Tony's name was there, in second place, approved for transfer to quality inspector on the afternoon shift, starting May 16th. He read it 3 times, as if the paper might change. Eddie was not on the list. Eddie looked, swallowed hard, and tried to smile. This time it happened, he said, but his voice failed at the end. Tony could not find good words. He touched his co-worker's shoulder for a second, a quick gesture that was neither consolation nor celebration. At lunch, he ate his sandwich in silence and watched the line as someone says goodbye to a rhythm that had held everything up, including the aches. He did not feel victory. He felt displacement, as if he were leaving behind not only a post, but a way of existing. At home that night, Lucia smiled in a way that had not appeared for weeks. She did not throw a party. She simply put more food on his plate and set the table with extra care. Paul looked at his father as if trying to guess what had changed. Tony said only what was necessary, a word that carried the whole month: transfer. On May 16th, Tony entered the inspection department. The environment was different. Less direct noise, more tables, instruments, clipboards, stacks of forms, stamps, and record folders. There was a smell of clean metal and stamp ink. An older man, Mr. Callahan, showed him a caliper and a micrometer and pointed to a set of sheets with fields for lot, measurement, tolerance, and signature. No number, no part, he said, as a rule that accepted no exception. The first week was difficult. Tony's hand, used to force, had to learn delicacy, as I had to adjust to small details, to reading scales, and to repeating measurements without hurry. He filled out forms carefully, measured parts, noted variations, plotted points on the chart. Sometimes he entered a field wrong and had to start over, because the paper did not accept erasures easily. Shame came, but he swallowed it. He did not sign without understanding. The pen and the stamp were tools as serious as a wrench. At the end of May, a shipment showed an out-of-control trend. Tony saw the line on the chart approaching the limit. The department supervisor wanted to release it quickly, and the production clock weighed as it always did when there was an order and a deadline. Tony asked to hold it. The request came out firm, without aggression. He pointed to the chart and the measurements, showing the rising sequence. There was a short silence, and the supervisor nodded. The tool was checked, and they found wear. They adjusted it before the parts became scrap. No one applauded. They simply continued the work. But that night, Tony came home with his body tired in a different way and his mind less heavy. He had prevented waste, perhaps avoided a small accident, perhaps only done what the paper required. Even so, it was usefulness. In June, the rent went up as the letter had promised, but the new wage covered part of the blow. Lucia reorganized the budget with the precision of someone who had been controlling variations for years without calling it statistics, cutting where she could and keeping what was essential. Paul got new shoes at the end of the month, bought at a store on 4th Street, and Maria took cough syrup without Lucia having to cut meat from the plate. Small things, but each of them was proof of continuity. The irreversible kept circulating. Raymond returned to the factory in July, not to the line, but to a light-duty post. His bandaged hand, now with a visible absence, always seemed larger than before. He walked slowly. Some men looked away, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of imagining their own bodies that way. On a hot afternoon, July 12th, 1955, with air sticking to skin and that washed blue of a Michigan summer, Tony saw Raymond in the corridor near the infirmary. Raymond looked at Tony's hands, then at his face, and said without emotion, "New job." Tony answered carefully, offering only the fact: inspection. Raymond nodded, as if the word were a distant place, and let out a short good that was neither praise nor envy, only a record. There was not much more to say. Raymond's loss was not a lesson. It was a fact, and the fact had stayed in his body. In the fall, the night classes ended. Tony received a simple certificate, a sheet with his name printed and the date, November 3rd, 1955, with the look of a school document and the practical value of proof. He put the paper in a dresser drawer, among paid bills and the children's birth documents. He did not hang it on the wall. The house had no space for trophies. But the paper existed, and existing was enough. When he went to work the afternoon shift, the certificate stayed there, invisible like a stored tool. The winter of 1955 returned with the same insistence as the one before. On December 19th, the first snow covered Detroit like a layer of silence, muffling sounds and leaving streets with tire tracks and salt scattered at the corners. Tony left his shift and walked to the car with his coat closed up to his chin. The factory lights cut the falling flakes at angles, as if the night were being drawn. On the radio, a voice spoke of production records and new car models for the following year. Tony listened without turning it off. Now the words did not feel like pure threat. They felt like part of the world, a world he had learned, somehow, to read. At home, Lucia had put a clean tablecloth on the table and lit a small candle, not for ceremony, but to break the darkness of the short afternoons. Paul, now nearly as tall as her shoulder, helped wash dishes. Maria had cut pictures from magazine. The heater worked. The house smelled of soup and soap, as if days could still be organized into simple things. Tony took off his boots, left the cold outside, and went to the drawer where the certificate was kept. He did not show it to anyone as if it were an achievement. He only checked that it was still there, the way one checks a tool, and closed the drawer. He sat at the table. Lucia looked at him, saw the gesture, and said softly, "Long day." Tony answered with a word that fit the whole year. It passed. The night went on with small sounds, cutlery, running water, paper being folded. Outside, Detroit kept growing, producing, changing, with its wide avenues and its smokestacks releasing steam into the cold air. Inside that house, the fear of being replaceable did not disappear completely, because it never disappeared for anyone who depended on a badge. But it had been pushed into a corner and kept under control by the habit of learning, by the real weight of an accident no one could undo, and by the measured, recorded work that was now part of the routine. And when Tony fell asleep early with his hands resting open, with no need to prove anything in the dark, the snow-covered city seemed for a few hours like a blank sheet already filled with firm lines, legible numbers, and a kind of severe calm that allowed life to continue. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.